Well, our guest is Roger D. Masters, Department of Government, Dartmouth College, Hanover, New Hampshire. He's a research professor at Dartmouth College, a Nelson A. Rockefeller Professor of Government, Emeritus at Dartmouth College, and President of the Foundation for Neuroscience and Society. And if I went over his bio, it would take a long time to cover it. After undergraduate study at Harvard, BA 55 in service in the Army, Masters completed graduate work in political philosophy at the University of Chicago, where he wrote his doctoral dissertation under the direction of Leo Strauss and Joseph Cropsey. And that Leo Strauss, the big neocon kingpin. The central theme of Masters' work is the philosophic and scientific exploration of the role of human nature in political and social behavior. Now, there's so much about this guy. His bio is about 100 pages long that for the next hour we have him. I just want to let him introduce himself and tell you the stuff about him he thinks you should know. And then I want to get into one of his big areas of research and documenting is the fact that when they started putting fluoride and different derivatives of it in the water supply and why they do that. And what the facts are, you can go check for yourselves. And, of course, his work ties into why is lawn fertilizer different than crop fertilizer? Well, why do they say with lawn fertilizer, don't put it on crops or your garden? Because it's toxic waste. It's the same thing with depleted uranium. They've got all these thousands and tens of thousands, well, more than that, millions of tons of it. They got to put it somewhere. It's very poisonous and radioactive, so they put it into weapons. It's hiding it in plain view. And so we will discuss this today because, you see, fluoride is only a catchphrase or a overall name that they were able to pass laws through Congress for. It's what goes along with what you know as fluoride in the water, and that's what he is an expert on, among other things. And so we're very honored to have Roger D. Masters on with us today. Thanks for coming on, Professor.
It's my pleasure. I thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it a great deal.
You bet. How did somebody who was under Leo Strauss get into the work of trying to warn people about fluoride in the water?
Well, Strauss was an amazing thinker, and he wanted us to read a great book to try and find out what that writer, whether it was Rousseau or Plato or whoever, what he was really trying to say that might be true, because the whole point about Western civilization is that we're a civilization that uses science to try and find out what is nature and human nature, what's the truth about it. And after a certain time, I realized that I was teaching all these old books like Plato or Rousseau, and that sometimes modern biology was, or modern science, was showing that what they were saying in these books was false. And I thought, gee, I got to tell people that this book, John Locke saying that the brain is a blank slate. Well, your brain isn't a blank slate. It's a much more complicated piece of meat than that. And I thought, gee, I got to explain that's wrong. Or Rousseau says humans were originally individuals running around all alone in the state of nature. And then I read about chimpanzees, and they're not like that. Oh, I can explain he was wrong. And so I've been working on that for a long time, and one thing leads to another.
How did you get into research on, at the end of the Manhattan Project, dumping it in the water supply? I want to start at the beginning and walk through that. But first, tell us what in your research led you to the mass chemical poisoning of the population.
What happened was I started thinking in just general terms about biology and human nature, and I went to a conference, and I heard a retired oil executive named Red Hodges from California give a presentation on how violent criminals have high levels of either lead or manganese in their blood. And this was very interesting to me, that we were putting pollution in the environment, and everybody says, lead toys are bad, and so pollution is bad, but they don't talk about how it might change the chemistry of your brain. And so I decided to study that.
Well, that's the old saying of mad as a hatter, because in the dyeing process they were using mercury and lead and things, and so you'd be mad as a hatter.
Oh, sure. And besides, what seems to have happened is that I mentioned this idea of a blank slate because there's this whole idea that, well, everything we do is stuff we learn, and there's no reason for understanding biology because it's deterministic or something.
When really you would say, what, 80% is nature instead of nurture?
Well, I think that we ought to start just to forget that and look at the facts. One of the things that Mr. Strauss taught us, he advised me when I finished my work, he says, always teach as if there's a silent student in class who knows more than you do. He wasn't an ideologist himself. Some of his students were, but if you imagine that, I have to imagine that there are some of your listeners who are going to know more than I do. And if I make mistakes, I want them to correct me. But I think what makes our civilization special is this possibility of an open-minded study, so that if the government says, oh, it's a great thing to fluoridate water, and I come across the discovery, wait a second, what counts is which chemical you use, and we got to relook at that and not just use one word, but say, wait a second, what are we actually doing? What's the science of it?
So you're talking about kind of the private individual mass consciousness or private intelligence agency where we all integrate our own research and then almost have our own private research going on, which then brings it all to a higher level. So let's get to the point when you bump in.
Let me explain how I got into this. That is, I started to look at pollution with lead and manganese, and I had to figure out, well, what does lead do to the brain? Now, lead has an effect on a particular chemical in the brain, a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And if you have a disturbance, dopamine is the chemical that works all the centers of your brain. They're involved in making judgments. It controls impulsiveness until you decide what's a good thing to do. And so I realized that there was a science about this that Americans had to know about. Because if Americans don't know why lead is bad or why manganese is bad, and then they don't know that pollution means that a company says, oh, it's too expensive to clean up this pollution, but they're poisoning the kids. And so I said, well, how is that? How is it poisoning the kids? And so I began to do studies. And this is a simple study. There are some counties in the United States where the EPA reports there's lead pollution, and other counties where they report there's manganese pollution. And I said, well, what kind of behavior is connected with lead pollution that we can measure? Well, I remember, Prof.Roger said violent crime, right? Well, we got good data on violent crime. You know, we keep track of how many people kill other people.
And so you can take the data on where areas have more lead contamination, and then you look at the areas where they have crime statistics, and voila, they lay over each other quite nicely, don't they?
Absolutely. To give you one example of that, which is just fantastic, we did something that was right when we banned leaded gasoline. Because when we banned leaded gasoline, it had the effect of reducing the crime rate. But not right away. Crime rate dropped in 1991. It was when the first generation of kids whose mothers weren't exposed to lead when they were pregnant. And they weren't exposed anymore so much because there was no more leaded gas. And that first generation, when they got to be 17 or 18, their criminal behavior just dropped way off.
And for those that don't know, in the 70s and 80s, it was just liquor store robberies, murder. The murder rate was a lot higher. I mean, it was really dangerous.
Absolutely.
And the cars were driving around shooting lead out the back.
That's right.
Which makes you violent in every thousands of studies.
Sure, but I discovered there are lots of other things. For instance, if you live in a community with a lot of old housing, since lead paint is in both the inside and outside of the old housing, and people point out that kids find the taste of lead paint sweet, so they're more likely that the chip of paint actually is something to eat it. But it's also true that, for instance, in the Ninth Ward of New Orleans, which was reputed to be terribly violent, must have heard of that, there's a scientist down there who did some work, and he found out that the big source of lead in the kids down there in the Ninth Ward was the grass strip between the sidewalk and the street. Because the lead gas came out of those cars back before lead gas was banned, as particles in the atmosphere, and it dropped in the ground, and it's inert. It just stays there forever so it it gets in the grass, and the grass is wet one day, and the kid's running down the street, and he falls down, and they put his hand in the grass, and the next thing he licks his hand, and before you know it, he's got the lead in his body. That is, you have to realize that there are many ways you can drive, as I put it, there's many ways to drive from Boston to Chicago, and there's many ways that a toxic chemical can get into kids. And if we get at this, we can cut down the cost of two things, three things actually that are important. First, learning disabilities, special ed, about $15,000 a year per kid, on some estimates. I got evidence that these toxic chemicals increase the rates of learning disabilities.
Well, obviously, let me stop you. I mean, lead, arsenic, mercury, fluoride, professor, and of course we should add you've won a lot of international awards for your research, groundbreaking, and now just accepted, basically as fact because it is.